come from Reston, Virginia. I work for Walmart Labs. I'm a software engineer 3 there. If anybody's interested in careers there, come talk to me. We're doing this cool stuff that there can be: React, GraphQL, Redux, Node, Java, everything you can think of. So the title of my talk is Learn Redux by Writing Redux. You will not be writing Redux. I will be writing Redux. So Redux is actually a really small piece of it. And then the connection to React is actually like where a lot of the meat is. So it turns out last Friday, React kind of deprecated or made Redux obsolete. So I wouldn't say it's obsolete, but good luck like migrating all of your projects if it's in Redux right now. So who here has they have no idea what Redux is? You just like raise your hand. Okay. So just like brief explanation. So really, it's just a state management library. The best thing about Redux is when you need to utilize, you have like data and components all over your web page, and you need to have shared data across these components. That's like the nice thing. And then also too, is that the tooling for Redux is phenomenal using Redux DevTools. So let's get it started. So I'm going to create a file called myredux.js. So basically, I'm going to create a function that returns an object. And this object is just going to return a state that I pass into it. So this function is going to be called createStore. And I'm going to create something called initial state. And I'm going to say input is hello. I'm going to say, so this takes in a state. And I'm going to call it state. I'm going to move this down so I don't get any name conflicts. I'm going to create a function called getState. And then this is just going to return the current state, not this .state. Okay? So then I'm going to create a store. I'm going to pass in my initial state. And then I'm going to do store.getState. And then all these are going to go away when I save, pretty much. OK, so now when I run that, and I need to change this. So just outputs the current state that I passed in. So this function is like pretty worthless, right? But we have a getState. So now we're like, OK, I want to change this state. So we're going to expose a method called dispatch. And this is going to take in an action. And then the action is going to have a type and a payload. And then that type is going to describe how we're going to change our current state. So we have a very declarative way of how we're changing and updating our state. So, well, how do we change our state? So we want to expose two things to our users. We want them to write their own actions and them to write their own reducers. So the great thing about Redux is the reducer method. That's what React came out and they wrote their own thing with hooks, and it's called like, I think it's just called so they have a method called useReducer, and then that exposes a dispatch method. So that's what Redux was all about, was like using the reducer method. So basically, a reducer, it takes your previous state and it takes in your action. And what did I say the action has? The action has a type and a payload, right? So the type will describe how you want to change it, and the payload is like you're changing it. So then here you just so by default you just return your previous state if you have no actions. Like if there is no type that's actually supposed to be changing it. So you just say like if type. So all we have on our state is just input. So we can just say like if the type is set input, then we take previous state, we spread it because we want to just change the input, because input is just, or previous state is just an object. So we can just do action.input. So here we have this reducer. So we're actually going to call this in the createStore method. So what we do is we can pass in an action and previous state. And then when the action is set input, it'll just like update the input, the state's input. It's really important that this is pure, and you'll see that why. It's pure being like whatever you put in, you'll always get the same result back. So right here, you could just say state equals reducer, but oh wait, we haven't passed it in yet. So instead of just passing initial state, we'll just pass in right here. We'll say state equals reducer. And if you see right here, right, this is how it's being called. We have reducer, and we pass in our current state, and then we pass in the action, which will be passed in through dispatch. And then we'll expose the dispatch method. So now, when we create our store, we want to pass in the reducer. And then we still just have store.getStates. Still the same thing. If you look, it's just input hello. So then now I can do store.dispatch. We could do type set input, and then we could set input. We'll change it to world. And we run that. So it's hello and world. Okay, so does that make sense? I'll be really looking for head nods. If I see some no's, then okay. So now we have that, and so we're like, cool. This is like, I don't know, like it's like okay, if we just have one file that's doing this, what if we want to create subscriptions? We want to be able to know when the state is changing. So let's create that. So we're going to create an object, and you will find out why we create an object. So you could do like an array, but you want to be able to unsubscribe. And when something's an object, it's going to be easier to unsubscribe. So we have subscriptions as an object. And then we just say const subscribe. And then we'll let the user define the callback. And then we pass in a unique ID. So then all you just do is subscriptions at ID equals callback. And then what we'll do when we run dispatch is we say subscribe. Is we say, OK, so here's some cool ES6. So we could just take subscriptions, object.values, and this will give me all the callbacks. And I could just run a .for each on this guy and just invoke all the callbacks. So basically, this is just saying, hey, I don't even care what the ID is. I'm just going to run all the callbacks, all the subscriptions. So then now here, I could get rid of these console.logs, and I could say store.subscribe. Store.getState. And then for the second parameter, I need to pass in the ID. So I'll just make it ASDF. So in here, you'll see I have this set input. So initially, it's only going to log world because it's only going to do it whenever I dispatch. As you can see, I only invoke subscribers on dispatches. So now I can do world 2, world 3. Yeah, I'm subscribing. So we don't. We'll learn when we make our higher order components in React. It's a memory. You'll have memory leaks. For me, I'm like, oh, so that's when it's like a memory leak. So say you have something still subscribing, but it's not it doesn't need to be subscribed. That's when I'm like, oh yeah, JavaScript can have memory leaks, even though it manages its own memory. So lesson of the day, computer science lesson of the day. So if you are pretty familiar with ES6, then this syntax will make sense. So I'm using object rest, and then I am just removing off the object, and then I'm just going to say subscriptions equals rest. So if that's confusing to you, it's fine. You can just do this. So I did that with my coworkers, and everyone freaked out. So, but yeah, so basically we just want to delete it. So that callback is no longer there. So we don't want to keep calling it. So now if you see, so we'll have world and then world 2. And so right here, we'll do store.unsubscribe, and it just cares about an ID. So we'll just do this. And if you'll see, world 3 is not printed out because it's no longer subscribed. So we just wrote Redux. No joke, we pretty much just wrote Redux. Actually, just kidding, I forgot one step. So the last piece of Redux is doing custom middleware. So there's things like Redux Thunk and Redux Saga, and there's loggers. So when you're doing actions, you could log every single action. So where that happens is there's a third parameter in your create store, which is apply middleware. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to do it. We're just going to put it in our dispatch method just for learning purposes, so you know what's happening under the hood. So really, the third parameter is apply middleware, but here we're just going to do it in dispatch. So say we wanted to create. So right now we have. So say you want to have. We're front-end developers, right? We want to have good user experiences, right? We can all agree on that. So one of the things we like to do is we want to display a loader to our user, hey, are you loading something, right? So we could say prev state, and then we say loading, action.loading. So we basically like, on our components, we'll do like a loading, and then if it's loading, then we'll display a loader. If not, then we won't, just so that our user knows that something's happening in the background. So say you wanted to do store.dispatch type set loading, false. And then we'll delete that, but we'll keep that there. So here it'll log the state every single time. So we'll see it'll have, now it has a loading, and let's add the loading. We'll make it false. So here we'll set the loading to true, and then assuming there's a UI attached to this, then it's like, okay, I'll display a spinner or something. And then it sets the input, and then it stops loading. So ideally, or usually it'd be like the middle part would be like a API call, right? So you see loading is true, and then we get the input, and then we set it to false. So the problem here is that like, how do you want to be able to abstract this code so that it's reusable? So you create something called a thunk. So this is a function that returns a function, and you can dispatch multiple times in this function. So then you're like, well, where do I get dispatch from? Like, I want to be able to dispatch, so could you just do, oh, I'll just move this up here. But the problem is that like, where are you getting that store from? Like, let me save that. Where are you getting the store from if this isn't an external file, right? Are you just going to like ESLint disable? No. So what we could do is we could just pass in dispatch. Like, okay, well, how the heck do I get that? So you can actually get dispatch by in your dispatch method. You could just say like, if type of action equals function, then you can just invoke the function and just pass in dispatch. Otherwise, I like update my state. So then what happens is, let me show, store.dispatch thunk. So I invoke this function, and then I return a function. And then my action is like, okay, I'm getting a function. Oh, okay, I'll just pass in dispatch. And then you can just use dispatch however you want. And then you can just keep going. And you can dispatch more thunks than that thunk because it's the same dispatch. It's kind of weird because like you're calling it in itself, but hey, it's JavaScript, so do what you want, right? So yeah, so now we have a reusable thunk that we can go ahead and do other things. So one of the last things, and I'll come back to this, just to simulate like a network request. I'll just wrap this in a set timeout. So 3 seconds, and then it never changed. Oh, it's probably because I'm not awaiting on the promise. So, because I unsubscribed before that. Hey, asynchronous, there it is. It's JavaScript, right? So, so this actually won't matter in when we actually, I won't unsubscribe. Oh, that's really interesting, huh? Okay, so it won't matter when we like hook it up to the React components. But yeah, so this is actually, we essentially just wrote Redux with the exception of like middleware. We just like hacked in our own thunk thing. But now like internally, you know what's happening, right? So we can subscribe, we can dispatch actions, we can get our current state, we can unsubscribe. So, so do I have any questions before I move along? Go ahead. How I got the initial hello? Yeah, so what happens is I dispatch type set loading, and initial state was already hello. And so if you notice, loading is true. And so it just changed loading true, but then input stayed at hello because I didn't change input yet. Say that again? What'd you say? Yeah. Yeah, so it's I mean, it changes only the piece of the state it wants to change, but I'm logging the whole state. It's not just logging like the piece of the state. Okay. Any other questions? I'll take one more question. Or no other questions. Is everyone like completely lost, or are you guys like good? I see some, yeah, okay, cool, all right. Awesome. Okay, so now let's hook it up to React. So React is awesome, and you will write a lot of it if you come work with me. So that could be a good or bad thing. I don't know, up to you. So we wanna create our code in a reusable or like smart way, right? So we're just gonna create a file called, or a folder called reducers. And then here in our index.js file, we'll just start copying and pasting stuff just so we can just reuse it. So we have this reducer, so we'll put this here. So we have an export const reducer, right? We'll just keep that there. And then here, we have this initial state.js. And then we'll put that in there. Okay. And then we don't want this anymore. We don't want that. And so then here, we will create some actions. And then now we have this reusable thunk that we can use anywhere. So that's right, it's reusable, right? Once it's in a file that you can export it in. And then we will use this create store. So let's dig into React. So I have this little app running that displays ASDF. Yes, hold your applause, please. So really, we just have this app.js. It just renders a router, and then internally in the router, it's just displaying this home component that just renders ASDF. So that's what that is. So what we want to do in React, we know that React, you have something called props.children. And what the children, you can just render every single thing in between like your tags. So that's what we're just going to do right now. And we're going to write our prop types because we're good developers. So we're going to create something called a provider, and then we're just going to return props.children. Provider dup, and we're going to mess up the prop types, and we say children. Yeah, so if you do any, shame on you. It's actually just Node and it works, and you won't get any linter errors, or any errors in the console. I just learned that recently, so good on me for that. So in app.js, now we just want to wrap this router and this provider, and then WebStorm's auto-completing some stuff, so that's why it's being a little weird. So now we just have this provider, and if you look at the provider, it's just rendering props.children, and then so it's just going to keep rendering whatever's beneath it. So if you see, we still have ASDF. Like, whoop-de-doo, what does that do for us? It doesn't do anything for us right now. What we want to do is so I showed you how to create Redux. I showed you how to create a store, right? So we want to pass that store. We want to be able to expose get state and dispatch, right? Because it's a global state. So we want all of our components to be able to hook into the state and utilize it, right? Because that's the whole point of Redux, right? Is utilizing that global state. So this is where we start using something called React's context. They actually just released something like, I don't know, like a couple weeks ago in React 16.6. Where they made consuming context like a lot simpler with Redux. So I'm glad. I did it at work, and like, everyone was like, their minds were blown when I did the consumption. But now with like the new way that you consume the context API, it's like a lot simpler. So we basically just want to do, so going back to just creating a store. So we have our store. This is like the same exact way that we created it before. And then auto imports, that's where those are coming from. And we have a reducer, and we have initial state. And then we could just pass this into our provider, right? So provider, just think of it, right? If you're not really familiar with React, right, these are just just think of them as like functions, and these are props that I'm passing in, so they're just like parameters in your function. So I'm passing in store as like a prop. It's also kind of like a parameter in a function. So now if I go to my Redux and I see my provider, now I can actually just do, so before I utilize the store, I need to put it somewhere. So in React, when you have a context, you can set it at any layer in your tree. So what we're doing is we're setting it in app.js. We have this provider, and then any descendant in your tree, like it could go like 50, 100 layers deep. It can access the context anywhere in the layer. But you have to do it, like you have to have access to the context object to be able to do that. That didn't really make sense, but that's okay. So we create context, React.create context. So now here, this exposes something called context.provider, props.children. Okay, so then now we need to set the value. And then we just say props.store, because that's where we got it. We got it in app.js, right? We have the store equals store we passed in. So then we just say this is proptypes.object that is required. So now everything's the same, still just ASDF. But we don't have any compile errors, so that's good. But we're setting the value of our context as the store. So now we're like, okay, that's great. That's great, Matt. We have, oops. That's great. We have this, but now we want to be able to consume it and use it. So now this is where we create something called a connect function. So the reason that expert const. So the reason that you have a function that returns a function is for composition, function composition. If you use something like compose from Redux, I would recommend looking it up in your spare time. If you have multiple higher order components, it's nice. So basically, we just want to take your component, and then we can just like return your component. So now we can like enhance our component. So now if I go to home.js, I can do like connect. And then still the same thing, right? Because this connect function is just taking in your component, and I'm just returning it. So that's like garbage. You can't really do anything with that. But now I can start adding extra props into this component. And then right here, I could just return this component. So basically, when connect happens, it takes in your component as an argument, and then it renders this higher order component. And then right here, I'm just going to return your component, and I'm going to make sure to forward all the props so that you still have access to all your props. And then here, I could pass whatever I want. So I could do like hello world, and if I go to home, I could do this.props.hello, and then now it's going to be world in the browser. So that's higher order components for you. So like you can, if you have like a logger you want to add, we wanted to, in my app, we had like a snack bar, and we wanted to make sure we translated it. We had to use React INTL's context. So we just like added a higher order component like with snack bar, and then it adds like a way so it'll translate it, because we like to internationalize our apps because Walmart is a global enterprise. So we have this higher order component now, and now all we have to do to access the context is you can just do static context type equals context, which is really nice. There's a way to use render props, and I'm not going to get into that, but render props are great. It was just in this context, if you wanted to use class functions or if you wanted to use the context throughout the whole class, and you had to wrap it in another component, and so it was like really confusing if you didn't really know what you were doing. So now we have this context. So I could actually just do like console.log this.context. So that's how I have access to context. So I can do this.context.getState. And then if you look right here, and then there's all these like freaking hot module things. But so if you see, that's the state right there, the input hello, loading equals false. That was the global state, right? So now if I went to like initial state, and I'm going to say this is Redux because it's coming from Redux. And look, we're getting it from Redux, okay? So now we want to expose like a clean, friendly way for all of our components to use Redux. So what we're going to do is we're going to create something called map state to props, and we're going to take a state, and we're going to take the state, and we're going to map our props. Like we're going to inject props into it using the state. So whatever this object is what this like the props will be. So we have this input. We're going to have an input, and we're going to say the value equals this.props.input, and then onChange equals this.props.onChange. And I'm going to skip writing prop types for now, just because I'm worried about time. But there's something called default props, where you can like just set, it's just when your prop is undefined, it just defaults to this. So then we'll just say input is not Redux. So then if we look in the browser, it's just not Redux, right? Okay. But we want to make that be Redux, right? We want to define the input. So right here, we could do map state. This is just a function. And then right here, the first argument, we can do map state to props. And there's a chance that somebody doesn't pass in that function, this function, so we'll just default it to a no op just to be safe, so we don't have to like check if it's defined and stuff. We can just do that, utilize ES6 stuff. So then right here we could just do this, just do return map state to props, and then get rid of that. This in that context, it gets state. And then if you look right here, you see this is the map state to props. So I'm injecting dependency injection. Yeah? No? I'm injecting the state right here. So this is the state that I'm getting it. I'm getting it from the context. I'm getting the store. So that's the actual store's get state. I'm injecting it into this map state to props. And then what I could do here is I could spread this.map state, and now it's injecting input. This object, it's injecting that into my component. So it's Redux. So now I'm getting it from the global state. So I could change this input to be like ASDF and go back to ASDF, right? So it's however I want it to be. But I want it to be state.input, right? Because it's Redux, it's from the global state. Okay. So one thing I want to do is I'm going to create a React function called display input. And then right here, I'm just going to display props.input. And then I'm going to do default props equal, well, it actually doesn't matter because I already have my connect. So here I'm going to show why, like about a memory leak. And a little bit. And then I need to wrap this in a div, and then I'm going to do display input. Okay, so I'm just displaying two different inputs. So another thing I want to do is I'm going to say, hey, if this props.input.length is greater than 3, just because our business users, our product owner came to us and said these are the requirements, and I blindly follow all the requirements. So I'd say, you know what, sounds good to me. This is what I'll do. I'll say if the input's greater than 3, then I'll just do it. I'll display it. If it's less than, then I won't display it. And you'll find out why I'm doing this in a little bit. So now we have that, but the thing is, though, is that I'm typing, nothing's happening, right? So I want to say, okay, well, so we had that dispatch, right? We all remember our dispatch, right? So we want to expose the dispatch method to our component. So this is where we could do map dispatch to props. And then we'll use dependency injection. We'll inject the dispatch function. And then here, we will inject these props into this. So on change, right, an input for the on change, it takes in an event, and we use event.target.value, right? So here we have on change, and then it's event, but I'll call it E. And I'll say dispatch, and then I pass in, right, we have the type. This is taking in an action. And then the input equals e.target.value. And then we pass in map dispatch to props as the second parameter. This is more common where the second parameter is undefined rather than the first parameter, but we go ahead and we'll just default them both to no ops. And then let me make this guy bigger. Okay? So then here we're pretty much going to do the same thing. We'll say return map dispatch to props, and then this.context.dispatch. But we won't invoke it. We'll let our consumer invoke us. Dispatch right here, because you see he's dispatching it right there. So in here, I could just this.map dispatch. Cool. So now we have a way to change the state. Oh, it's not changing. So what's actually happening internally is the state is actually updating, kind of, but the thing is that our component needs to know to like take the new, because remember we wrote our subscription method, so that's where the subscribe comes in. So so what happens is when a React component gets on the DOM, so component did mount, it only when it gets on the DOM, it only fires one time. And so you want to do subscriptions on component did mount, because now it's mounted, it's on there, it's not going anywhere unless we remove it, and that's when component will unmount happens, and you can unsubscribe things. So in my component right here, I can do component did mount, and I could say this.context.subscribe, and then instead of like, we'll just use like a random ID generator to like to subscribe, right? Because we don't care what our ID will be. And then when this component is created, we'll just do ID equals short ID.generate. Okay? And then here, each component actually has a force update method. And so I'm saying, hey, when the state's changing, then force an update and make myself re-render. And then when the re-render happens, I take the new state. And so then I'll display a new state. And then the ID will just be the setState.id. Okay? So then now, oh, it's working. And then pay attention to the console. When I get below 3, oh, what I was saying about the memory leak, right? So, so what happens is I never unsubscribed the component that is not on the DOM anymore. So it's still like firing enforce updates, but it's like, but there's nothing to update because it's not there anymore. So that's where we want to do a cleanup. So if you do component will unmount, spelled that wrong. You can do this.context.unsubscribe, this.state.id. And then now, no errors. So that's our component. That's we're all connected to Redux and everything. So now let's create a, so now let's add another piece. This is loading. Okay. And then we'll say this.props.loading. Otherwise, we'll just display null. And then we're going to put a little button. Hit the network, right? Not on press. This isn't React Native. And then we'll do, we'll call it hit the network. Okay? And then right here, hit the network. And then we can dispatch, and then we have that thunk that we declared in the other file, actions. So we have this thunk right here, and then it's all hooked up with the middleware, and it has the dispatch. So then now, if I hit this, I don't know, we'll see what happens. Oh, it's loading. And then it changed the world because we defined the thunk as it would hit world. So, and we didn't have to worry about random unsubscriptions, right? So that's helpful. So some of the last things I want to just touch on. So a good thing to do would be like create action types. So you can like set input. So architecturally, that's a good thing. So you just do set input, and then when you're using set input, just use this constant variable. Another popular thing and good thing to do is do something called action creators. And then this takes in loading. So an action creator is a function that returns an action. So basically, it's just like a little wrapper around the object, so we're not like just hard coding it every single time. So then right here, I could do like type is set loading, right, which is declared in another file, right, because that's what I was saying you should do, and you just do loading. So then you're not doing like the object and the type and everything. It's like through one specific function every single time. And then the last thing, that's a good thing to do. If you go to your reducers, there's something called selectors. So it's a really cool thing. So basically, every single place that you want to pull anything off of your state, so you do like get input, you just take in your state, and you just return that piece of the state. So then instead of doing state.input, you just pass in get input state, and it's still the same thing. And then in your display input, you do the same thing. So then what happens is if you start reshaping your state, you only have to change it in your selector. You don't have to change it in all of your map state to props. So still the same value. And then two, what's nice is that say you had to do like a filter, but you didn't want to change your Redux state. You can just do the filter in your selector, and you're not like changing something in your render method. It's really easy to update it or to test it and everything. So yeah, that's actually like my whole talk. So I could take questions for the rest of the time, or just let you off early, whatever you guys want.
You want to talk a little about like the context
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So context. So context, right? We have a provider, and then you put all the children inside of it. So it's like but it's not really a child. It's pretty much like descendants, right? It's like if you have a child, and that person has a child, right? That's your descendant, right? So it'll render all of the descendants, right? And then if you have access to the context, you can then hook into the provider's like value. What are the questions about that? Which right here? Oh yeah, context? Context type? Yeah, so that's actually, I was using this.context. Yeah. Yeah, that says like, hey, this is my context, and you can use it. You can use like the value set. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Cool. Well, thanks for coming. Yeah, I appreciate it.